There is a particular kind of silence that belongs to the end of things. Not the silence of a quiet morning or an empty church, but the silence of a life that has been boxed up, cataloged, and reduced to a collection of cardboard containers stacked against a concrete wall. Margaret Ashford had lived inside that silence for 6 months, and by November she had almost stopped noticing it. The storage unit. The storage unit was 8 feet wide and 10 feet deep, tucked into the back row of a facility on the edge of Northwest Glisson Street in Portland. She paid $90 a month for the privilege of keeping what remained of 40 years inside it. The smell was naphthalene and cold concrete, the kind of smell that belongs to things that have been given up on. Two industrial shelving units held her drafting equipment wrapped in plastic. A wardrobe box leaned against the far wall, and stacked from floor to ceiling along the left side were 17 numbered cartons, each one representing a portion of a career she no longer had. Margaret, who had gone by Meg since the second grade and refused to answer to anything else, sat on the edge of carton number 11 with her coat still buttoned and her breath fogging slightly in the November air. She was 65 years old. She had the hands of someone who had spent 4 decades drawing precise lines and the posture of someone who had spent the last 6 months trying not to collapse under the weight of what those precise lines had cost her. 40 years, 3 buildings that bore her name on the cornerstone, a firm with 7 employees that she had built from a single drafting table and a phone. Gone in 18 months, dismantled by a combination of bad contracts and deliberate betrayal, and on paper the fault belonged entirely to her, because her name was on every document that Leonard Gable had used to sign away the company's future. Leonard was 60 years old and had worked beside her for a decade. She had trusted him the way you trust someone. You have trained someone you have defended in rooms. They were not allowed to enter someone you have vouched for when the stakes were high enough that your own credibility was the collateral. He had used that trust to sign agreements with clauses she never saw to drain the operating fund into accounts she never knew existed and to file for bankruptcy protection before she understood what was happening. He was currently in Amsterdam. She had not spoken to him since the day the eviction notice appeared on her apartment door. $80,000 in debt, a pension fund that would not mature for another 2 years, a storage unit in Portland. People tended to assume that losing everything at 65 was worse than losing everything at 35 because there was less time to rebuild. Meg had thought about that assumption carefully and concluded it was wrong, though not in a comforting way. The real difference was that at 65, you could look back and see clearly what each lost thing had actually cost you to build. You knew the exact price of every hour and every sacrifice. The loss was not abstract. It had weight and texture and a precise dollar figure attached to every year of your life. She reached into carton number 11 looking for the portable space heater she remembered packing in October. What she found instead, wedged between 2 rolled tubes of architectural drawings that she had not opened in a year, was a small envelope she had never seen before. It was the kind of envelope that had aged to a deep ivory, the paper softened at the corners from years of contact with other surfaces. Her name was written on the front in handwriting she recognized. Before she had consciously processed that she recognized it, Arthur Ashford had a particular way of forming capital letters, slightly forward-leaning, the M in Margaret opening wide like a gate. She had seen that handwriting on birthday cards and permission slips, and the occasional note left on the kitchen counter, and she had not seen it in 35 years because Arthur Ashford had died on Interstate 5 when Meg was 30 years old, and the dead do not leave notes. She opened it. Inside was a single photograph, black and white, printed on the kind of photographic paper that had a slight texture to it the kind used in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Her father stood in front of a large Victorian structure, 3 stories of dark timber and peaked gables, with a wall of evergreen forest rising behind it. He was not looking at the camera. He was looking at the building with an expression she could not quite read, something between wariness and determination. She turned the photograph over. On the back in pencil in her father's handwriting, "If you ever come here, do not go alone." Meg sat with the photograph for a long time. She did not know the building. She did not know when the picture had been taken or how it had ended up in a carton of her drafting equipment. She had no memory of it existing. And Arthur Ashford had been dead for 35 years, which made the instruction on the back of the photograph not a warning so much as a message from a man who had somehow known decades before the fact that his daughter would one day find her way to a place he had felt the need to caution her about. The buzzer on the storage unit entrance rang once, indicating that someone had opened the exterior gate. Meg slipped the photograph into her coat pocket. 20 minutes later, she found the envelope from Mercer and Associates waiting in the mailbox at the address she had given as her forwarding contact, a print shop 2 blocks away that charged her $12 a month to hold her mail. The return address was a law firm in downtown Portland. The letterhead, when she opened it at the print shop counter, was the kind that communicated money and deliberateness in equal measure. Douglas Mercer, estate in probate law. The letter requested her presence at his offices at her earliest convenience in connection with the estate of Eleanor Whitfield, deceased. Meg did not recognize the name. She went anyway because she had learned in the past 6 months to follow the threads that presented themselves, since generating new ones had become considerably more difficult. The offices of Mercer and Associates occupied the 14th floor of a glass building on the west side of downtown Portland, with windows that looked out over the Willamette River on one side and a view of the Cascade foothills on the other. The reception area had the particular quality of expensive restraint, the kind of decoration that announces wealth by refusing to announce anything at all. Meg sat in a chair that probably cost more than her monthly storage fee and waited. Douglas Mercer was 67 years old, with the posture of a man who had spent his career seated behind desks that reinforced his authority. His suit was gray and pressed with a precision that suggested either a very good dry cleaner or a deeply controlling personality. His eyes were the color of old pewter, and they held the exhausted alertness of someone who had spent decades holding other people's secrets. He explained the situation in the careful, bounded way of a man who had decided exactly how much he was going to say before he sat down. Eleanor Whitfield was Meg's great-great-aunt by marriage, the younger sister of her maternal grandfather's wife, a connection thin enough that Meg had never thought of her as a real relative. Eleanor had lived in isolation on a property in Willow Creek, Oregon, since the late 1980s, cutting off contact with the extended family entirely at some point around that time. She had died recently quietly at the property. She had left the estate to Meg in its entirety, along with a trust sufficient to cover property taxes for 5 years. There were no keys. Eleanor had left explicit instructions that all existing keys to the property be destroyed upon her death. The locks, Mercer said with the careful neutrality of a man reciting something he found personally absurd, had not been changed. The will contained a specific clause. "To my great-niece Margaret Ashford, I leave the house and all its burdens. She will receive no keys. If she is meant to claim what is inside, the house will let her in. If it does not, she must walk away and never return." Meg looked at the man across the desk. She was 65 years old and had spent 40 years in rooms with people who used language as a tool for strategic concealment. She knew what it looked like when someone was telling you only what they had decided you needed to hear. She looked down at the paperwork spread across the polished surface between them. The probate documents, the death certificate, the property deed. Her eyes stopped on the notary stamp at the bottom of the will. The date on the stamp was November 14th, 1989. Meg looked up slowly. She calculated. Arthur Ashford had died on Interstate 5 on November 11th, 1989. 3 days before this document was signed, Eleanor Whitfield had signed a will leaving everything to a woman she barely knew 3 days after the death of that woman's father. There was either a connection or a coincidence, and Meg had spent enough time in the world to know how rarely the second option was the correct one. She was about to speak when she noticed something else. Beneath the probate file, tucked so that only its corner was visible, was a small envelope. A personal envelope, not a legal document. Her name was written on it in handwriting she did not recognize. She reached across the desk and pulled it free. Mercer did not stop her, but something in his posture shifted the way it shifts in a person who has been caught withholding something they were not sure they had the right to withhold. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper folded once. The handwriting was old-fashioned and precise, the kind formed by someone who had learned to write in the era when penmanship was considered a reflection of character. It said, "Arrive before they do. Do not ask Mercer why." Eleanor. Meg set the note on the desk between herself and the lawyer. She did not speak immediately. She had learned long ago that silence in a negotiation belonged to whoever was willing to hold it longest. And Douglas Mercer did not look like a man who was comfortable with what was sitting between them. She said quietly and without particular accusation, "Eleanor knew you would not be entirely honest with me. She wrote that down and made sure I would read it in your presence. That puts you in an interesting position." Mercer said nothing. His hands folded on the desk did not move, but the small muscles around his jaw tightened by a fraction. She said, "When I leave this building, you are going to make a phone call. I would like to know to whom." He said, "I am the executor of this estate, Miss Ashford. My obligation is to execute the terms of the will as written. Nothing more." She said, "That is not an answer." He said, "No, it is not." She picked up the envelope with Eleanor's note and put it in her coat pocket next to the photograph of her father. She stood, collected the documents Mercer had prepared for her, and thanked him in the formal tone she reserved for people she did not intend to trust. She was in the elevator before she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened in that office. She called Patricia from the parking structure. The call connected on the second ring, which meant her daughter had been near her phone, which meant Patricia had been waiting. Patricia Webb was 38 and taught fourth grade in Eugene. She had her father's patience and Meg's stubbornness, a combination that made her excellent with children and occasionally exhausting in an argument. She had been Meg's primary support through the collapse of the firm, the kind of steady, practical support that does not offer false comfort, but does ensure that basic necessities are addressed. When Meg finished explaining about the estate, the no keys and the note from Eleanor, there was a silence on the line that had a specific quality to it. Patricia said, "You are not actually considering driving to a condemned house in the Oregon mountains alone because a dead woman you never met left you a cryptic note." Meg said, "The house is not condemned, it is in a state." Patricia said, "Mom." Meg said, "I have $80,000 in debt and nowhere to live after January. The property is legally mine. I need to assess it." Patricia said, "You need to hire a lawyer and a real estate agent, and you do not need to drive 6 hours in November to do it." She said, "Your grandmother's sister left me this property for a reason." Eleanor Whitfield signed that will 3 days after your grandfather died. "Do you understand what I am telling you?" Another silence different from the first. Patricia said carefully, What does that mean? Meg said. I do not know yet. That is why I am going. Patricia exhaled slowly. She said, last week I received an email. It was addressed to me professionally through my school account from a university address I did not recognize. It said the sender was conducting research into local architectural history and wanted to speak with me about my grandfather's professional work. I deleted it because I thought it was spam. Meg went very still. She said, Patricia, which folder did your email system put it in? Patricia paused. She said, junk. It went directly to junk. I only saw it because I was clearing the folder. Meg said, which folder did the email system assign it to automatically, or did you mark it yourself? A longer pause. Patricia said automatically. I never touched it. Someone had ensured that email would be filtered before Patricia read it carefully. That was not the behavior of a university researcher. That was the behavior of someone who wanted to make contact while limiting the chance that the contact would be scrutinized. Meg said, do not open any unusual emails. Do not discuss Eleanor Whitfield or Oak Haven with anyone. Lock your doors tonight. Patricia said, you are frightening me. Meg said, good. Being frightened is appropriate right now. I will call you from the road. She drove north out of Portland and then turned east into the Cascades following the hand-drawn map Mercer had provided along with the property documents. She had spent 6 months existing in a contracted world of storage units and forwarding addresses and instant meals eaten standing at a kitchenette counter, and the act of driving into open country with a destination had a quality she had almost forgotten. Not hope exactly, something more practical than hope, a direction. The rain began as she crossed into the mountain's light at first, and then heavier as the elevation climbed. GPS signal deteriorated and then vanished in the 20 miles before the town of Willow Creek, which was exactly as the map had indicated it would. The town itself was the kind of place that told its own story through the rate at which things had been allowed to decay. Meg had spent 40 years reading buildings, understanding what structures said about the people and economies that had shaped them, and Willow Creek said clearly that the logging industry that had built it had been dying for decades. The storefronts along the main street showed the sequence of closures the way growth rings show drought years, and the buildings that remained open were doing so with the specific exhaustion of things that have simply not yet stopped. She pulled into the only gas station showing lights and got out into the cold drizzle. The man who appeared beside her car had not come from inside the station. He had been standing near the air pump, which meant he had been waiting, and the positioning was deliberate enough that Meg registered it before she consciously processed his presence. He was 55 years old and large in the particular way of men who have done physical work their entire lives. He wore a heavy jacket that was not his uniform jacket, but the badge pinned to it was a county sheriff's badge, and the way he carried himself was the way of someone accustomed to occupying authority in a space. His face was weathered and reddened from years of outdoor exposure, and his eyes were a pale, watchful gray. He said, you passing through or looking for something specific? She said, I am the new owner of the Oak Haven property. I am on my way there now. He did not change expression, but something behind his eyes shifted in a way she recognized. People react to the names of things that matter to them. This man had reacted to Oak Haven. He said that property has been closed for 10 years. Road up the mountain gets dangerous in wet weather. She said, I am aware of the conditions. I appreciate the concern. He said, Dale Briggs County Sheriff. Take my card. Call if you need assistance up there. She took the card. She thanked him. She got into the car. In the rearview mirror, as she pulled out of the station and onto the highway, she watched him stand exactly where she had left him, unmoving his hand inside his jacket pocket. He did not go back into the station. He did not get in his vehicle. He stood and watched her go. And then just before she rounded the bend and lost sight of him, he brought his phone to his ear. The logging road began 4 miles north of town and climbed at a pitch that made the rental car's engine work in a way it was not designed for. The pavement ended within a quarter-mile. After that, it was compacted earth and gravel rutted from recent rain, with stands of Douglas fir pressing close on both sides, and the sky overhead reduced to a narrow gray channel between the canopy tops. The wrought iron gates were at the end of the road, where the tracks simply stopped and the property began. They were heavily rusted, wound through with English ivy that had been growing undisturbed for years, and they stood open, pressed inward as though someone or something had forced them apart long ago, and there had been no one to close them since. Meg parked the car, pulled on her waterproof jacket, and took the heavy flashlight from the passenger seat. She stepped out into the drizzle and looked at what Eleanor Whitfield had left her. Oak Haven was a Victorian Gothic structure of the kind that required not one architect, but a committee of people who had each read too many novels and been given an unlimited budget. 3 stories of dark timber under a system of peaked gables with narrow windows set at intervals that seemed designed more for surveillance than for light. A wraparound porch sagged at its southern end where the support posts had given way. The surrounding gardens had long since stopped being gardens and become instead a chaotic density of overgrown rhododendrons and encroaching briar through which the remnants of what had once been formal paths were barely visible. Most people would have looked at Oak Haven and seen an abandoned house. Meg looked at it and saw something else. The sagging porch was consistent with decades of neglect. The weathering of the timber siding was consistent with the Pacific Northwest climate, over 30-plus years of minimal maintenance. Those things were expected. But the structural elements that ran beneath the decorative Victorian details were not what they should have been. The load-bearing supports at the corners of the building were heavier than Victorian residential construction required. Much heavier. She could see the profile of them where the exterior trim had pulled away slightly at the seams, revealing the steel reinforcement beneath. Someone had added substantial structural support to this building, and they had hidden it under the decorative elements of the original style. The drainage system along the foundation was wrong in a different way. Not degraded or damaged, simply disproportionate, larger in diameter than residential drainage required, running in patterns that served something below the structure rather than away from it. This building had been renovated from the inside out. Someone had taken a Victorian house and rebuilt its bones into something else entirely, carefully preserving the exterior appearance while fundamentally changing what the structure was designed to do. And whoever had done it had been meticulous about ensuring that the changes would not be visible to a casual observer. Meg was not a casual observer. She climbed the rotting porch steps, which groaned steadily under her weight. She had the crowbar in her bag, brought with the intention of breaking a rear window if necessary. She was reaching for the bag strap when she looked up at the front door. The door itself was double-hung oak, original to the Victorian construction, weathered and stained and cracked at several points in the wood grain. The ironwork on the hinges was dark with rust. The exterior trim around the frame showed decades of paint layers cracking and peeling away in sequence. The brass handle on the right-hand door was polished to a mere brightness that had no business being on any surface in this place. Not slightly less tarnished than its surroundings, not clean at some point in the past year, actively maintained, regularly polished, the kind of brightness that required consistent attention. And the door was not shut. It stood open by perhaps 3 inches, a vertical slice of absolute darkness visible in the gap. And from that gap came a slow, cold exhalation of air that carried the smell of dried lavender and old dust, and something else beneath both of those, something faint and metallic that she could not immediately identify. She stood on the porch in the cold rain and looked at the gap in the door and thought about what it meant, not what the will had said about the house letting her in. She was 65 years old and had no interest in mystical explanations for physical phenomena. What it meant practically and concretely was that someone had been here recently. The brass handle required regular maintenance to look like that, and the door had been opened by someone in the past few hours because the smell coming through the gap was the smell of interior air that had been recently disturbed, not the stagnant air of a completely sealed space. The weight of her debt, the eviction notice, the $80,000, the storage unit at $90 a month, the pension fund that would not mature for 2 more years. She wrapped her gloved hand around the polished brass handle and pushed. The door swung inward on hinges that had been oiled recently enough that the creak was only moderate, a long, low complaint, rather than the shriek that the condition of the exterior would have suggested. She clicked on the flashlight and swept the beam into the space beyond. The foyer was cavernous and still the ceilings high enough that the upper reaches disappeared into shadow. Thick cobwebs hung from the plasterwork and curtains that swayed in the draft from the open door. Furniture lined the walls draped in white sheets that had grayed with age and dust. A staircase of dark mahogany swept upward from the center of the space, its treads covered in a runner that might once have been crimson and was now a uniform brown. Dust lay on the hardwood floor in a layer undisturbed for years, except for the footprints. She saw them when she swept the light downward to get her bearings. 2 sets distinctly different from each other pressed into the dust with the clear edges of impressions made within the past few hours. The first set was large, heavy-treaded boots, the kind worn for work or tactical purpose. They came in through the front door and crossed the foyer diagonally toward a corridor on the right side of the space. The second set was smaller and had the narrower profile of a hiking boot. They also came from the direction of the front door, followed approximately the same path, but the return impressions of the second set had a different stride length than the impressions going in, longer and irregular, the pattern of someone who had been walking fast. She studied the edges of the prints with the beam held close to the surface, sharp, undisturbed. The ambient air currents in the space had not yet begun to soften the borders of the dust displacement. These had been made within the past 3 or 4 hours at most. She was not alone in this house. She might not have been alone in this house for some time. Meg followed the footprints down the corridor, her flashlight beam moving across a series of portraits hung at intervals along the wall. Men and women in the formal dress of the late 19th and early 20th century, their painted eyes following the light. The corridor opened at its far end into a large room, and she stepped through the archway and stopped. The library was immaculate, not cleaning recently in the way a room is cleaned when someone notices it needs attention. Maintained consistently and deliberately with the kind of ongoing care that is part of a routine. The floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that covered 3 of the 4 walls were organized with precision, their leather-bound spines arranged by size and aligned at their fronts with geometric regularity. There was no dust on the floor, no cobwebs in the upper corners, and the stone fireplace along the south wall held a fire that was burning steadily, with logs of a size and arrangement that indicated someone had built it within the past couple of hours. Between the 2 leather armchairs positioned facing the fire, a small side table held a silver tray. On the tray was a teapot with steam still rising from its spout, and beside it, arranged with the same care as the bookshelves, 2 porcelain cups. 2 cups, not 1. 2 cups prepared for 2 people in a room where Meg had not existed until this moment except as a name on a legal document. She had not told anyone she was coming today. She had not told anyone this specific hour or this specific route. She had spoken to Patricia from the road and had mentioned she was driving to the property, but had not said when she expected to arrive. Someone had prepared tea for 2 people in this room, and she was standing in it holding a flashlight, and she had no reasonable explanation for either of those things. A voice came from the far corner from the shadows behind the high back of the chair that faced away from the door. It said I was beginning to wonder if the storm had washed out the lower bridge. She swung the beam toward the sound. The man who raised his hand against the light was in his late 50s, dressed in a tweed vest over a white-collared shirt and dark wool trousers with a neatly trimmed gray beard and pale eyes that caught the firelight even while being obscured by the flashlight's glare. He did not look frightened. He did not look caught. He looked with specific precision like a man who had been sitting in that chair for some time and had decided that this particular moment had finally arrived. She said, "Who are you and how do you know my name?" He said, "My name is Harold Crane, and I would ask you to lower the light because I have had a migraine since mid-afternoon, and the beam at this distance is genuinely painful." She did not lower it. He said, "I am not trespassing, Margaret. I live here. I have lived here in this house for the last 22 years. She looked at the fire. She looked at the maintained bookshelves and the organized shelves and the steaming teapot. She looked at the man in the chair. She said, "My great-aunt lived here alone. The attorney told me she died in isolation." He said Eleanor Whitfield was many things. Owen was not among them. He stood slowly, keeping his hands visible, and stepped to the side table where he lifted the teapot and began to pour into the first cup with the practiced ease of someone performing a routine he had performed thousands of times. He did not look at her while he poured. She said, "This room is maintained differently from the rest of the house. The condition of the foyer and the corridor and the exterior are consistent with genuine decades-long neglect. This room has been continuously cared for, which means either the rest of the house is deliberately staged or someone has been maintaining this room specifically while allowing the rest of the structure to deteriorate as cover. Given the structural modifications I observed on the exterior, I think it is the second option." He paused with the teapot in his hand and looked at her with an expression she had not expected from a stranger in an abandoned house. He looked impressed. He said, "Eleanor told me you were an architect." She said Eleanor Whitfield did not know me. He said Eleanor Whitfield knew considerably more than you are aware of. She made it her business to know. She took a step back toward the archway, keeping the light on his face and her hand at the edge of the doorframe. She said the footprints in the foyer, 2 sets coming in from the front. One did not leave the same way it came in. He set the teapot down. His expression shifted. He said, "When did you arrive?" She said, 20 minutes ago. He moved to the window, reached behind the heavy velvet drape, and pulled it aside. The glass behind it was shattered. Fragments lay on the polished floor in a pattern consistent with impact from the outside. The edges of the break were recent enough that some of the smaller pieces had not yet settled flat. He said, "They came in early this morning. I spent most of the day securing what I could. The front door was their work, not the house welcoming you. They forced it open, and I could not reseal it without the mechanism that controls it." She said, "Mechanism." He said, "The locks in this house are not conventional, Margaret. They were designed by Eleanor over a period of years to respond to something that cannot be copied or stolen or melted down. I need you to listen to me very carefully because we have considerably less time than I would like." He walked to the large oak desk near the interior wall, reached beneath it, and pressed something that produced a soft mechanical click. A section of the floor-to-ceiling bookshelf swung outward from the wall on a hidden pivot. Behind it, mounted on a rack, was a bank of high-definition security monitors displaying grayscale feeds from cameras positioned around the exterior of the property. On the fourth monitor in the thermal register, three white shapes moved through the tree line behind the carriage house. The shapes were moving with the particular patience and coordination of people who had done this kind of thing before. He said, "The front door was not waiting to welcome you, Margaret. It was forced open by men who are willing to tear this house down to its foundation. Eleanor left you no keys because the locks inside this house do not respond to brass and iron. They respond to bloodline. I need you to open the lower vault before those men decide they have waited long enough." She looked at the monitors. She looked at the shapes in the tree line. She looked at the man who'd been living inside this house for 22 years. She said, "If I walk out the front door right now, what happens?" He said, "They have been watching the access road for 5 days. They let you come because they needed you inside to unlock what Eleanor locked. Now that you are here, you are not a person to them. You are a tool that has served its purpose." She said, "That is not an answer to my question." He said, "No, it is not." She felt her phone vibrate once in her pocket. She pulled it out. The message was from a number she did not recognize, and it contained only an image. The image was a photograph taken from a distance. It showed a woman standing outside a two-story building in what appeared to be late afternoon light. The woman was 38 years old and wore a dark jacket over a cream-colored blouse, and she was reaching into her bag for her keys with the automatic motion of someone arriving home from work. The building in the background was the elementary school in Eugene, where Patricia Webb had been teaching fourth grade for 6 years. The timestamp at the bottom of the image read 6 hours ago. The photograph on the screen was Patricia, standing outside her school. 6 hours ago, someone had been close enough to capture her face with clarity, which meant close enough to do considerably worse, and had chosen instead to send the image to a phone number that only a handful of people possessed. The message was not a threat stated in words. It did not need to be. Meg looked up from the phone at Harold Crane, who was watching her with the stillness of a man who had already worked through the mathematics of this moment before she arrived. She said, "You knew they were watching her." He said, "I suspected they had expanded their surveillance perimeter to include known family contacts approximately 2 weeks ago, the day Eleanor's condition deteriorated beyond recovery." She said, "And you did not find a way to warn her." He said, "Any contact I initiated would have confirmed that Patricia was a relevant variable. Silence was the less dangerous option." She looked at the monitors. The three shapes in the tree line behind the carriage house had moved 20 yards closer to the structure in the past 4 minutes. They were not rushing. They were methodical, which was worse than rushing because it meant they had done this before and were not concerned about the outcome. She said, "I need to call her." He said, "If you call from inside the signal range of whatever equipment they have deployed around this property, they will triangulate her location in under 5 minutes. They are using her as leverage to push you toward the vault, not as a primary target. The moment you demonstrate that the leverage is working, she becomes the kind of problem that gets resolved permanently." She put the phone in her pocket. This was not compliance. This was arithmetic. The arithmetic said that doing nothing was currently safer for Patricia than doing something, and she was willing to accept that calculation for exactly as long as the arithmetic held. She said, "Show me the vault." He moved immediately with the efficiency of a man who had rehearsed this sequence in his mind enough times that the physical execution of it required no deliberation. He came around the desk and headed for the far end of the library toward a narrow doorway that led into the servants' corridor she had not yet explored. She followed. The corridor was windowless and smelled of damp earth and rust, precisely the smell of a structural space that had been sealed from its original function for decades. He moved through it at pace and she kept close behind him, her flashlight supplementing the sparse aged fixtures overhead. They descended a staircase of bare stone steep enough that she had to put her hand against the wall for balance into the cellar. The air dropped 15 degrees as they reached the bottom. Her breath became visible. The space was extensive, supported by stone pillars, and lit by a single string of utility lighting that Harry must have installed himself at some point in the past 2 decades because the fixtures were not original to the Victorian construction. Empty wine racks stood along the outer walls. Furniture draped in canvas occupied the middle section, arranged with the randomness of storage rather than the intentionality of use. She watched the walls as they moved through the space. The stonework was original along the east and north sides, consistent with late 19th century foundation construction. But as they moved toward the western end, the composition changed. The mortar joints were different. The stones themselves were different in their selection, more uniformly sized, more deliberately placed. Someone had rebuilt this section of the wall at a different time using materials that matched the original well enough to pass casual inspection. They reached the end of the cellar where the western wall presented itself as a solid mass of mortared riverstone. Harry reached into the breast pocket of his vest and produced a small, heavy medallion of brass roughly the size of a silver dollar and engraved on one face with a pattern she could not immediately identify. He pressed it against a specific point in the wall, a stone that was slightly recessed relative to its neighbors, and held it there with steady pressure. The sound that followed was pneumatic, a controlled release of compressed air from somewhere within the wall structure. The stone facade in front of them split cleanly down a vertical center line, and the two halves retracted outward on concealed tracks moving with the silent precision of a mechanism that had been regularly maintained. Behind them was a blast door of industrial steel set flush in a concrete frame. The surface was matte gray and showed no handle, no keypad, no visible locking mechanism of any kind. In the center of the door, mounted on a brass plate at approximately chest height, was a sculpted lion's head. The jaws open wide, the interior of the mouth, a smooth cavity of polished metal. He said it is a biometric blood sampler. Eleanor designed the protocol herself and had the mechanism fabricated by an independent contractor who was paid to build it and asked no questions about its purpose. It reads a specific genetic marker in the blood sample, a marker unique to Eleanor's maternal line. The mechanics are straightforward. You insert your hand into the mouth. The mechanism takes a small sample from the index finger, analyzes the DNA sequence against the stored profile, and if the match falls within the threshold, Eleanor specified for familial inheritance, the magnetic locks disengage. She said, and if it does not match? He looked at her steadily. He did not answer. The silence told her what the answer was. No one had ever tested the failure condition because Eleanor had ensured that the only person who would ever attempt to open this door would be the right person, or no one would open it at all. She was reaching for the lion's head when every light in the cellar went out simultaneously. The darkness was total. She had the flashlight, and she clicked it on in the same instant, but the beam felt suddenly inadequate in a space that had gone from lit to black without warning. 5 seconds of complete quiet. Then a low mechanical hum built from somewhere beneath the floor, and the backup generator engaged with a vibration she felt in her feet before she heard it with her ears. And the cellar was bathed in the flat red of emergency lighting. The sound from above her was not ambiguous. It was a single concussive impact against a structural surface, the kind made by something very large and very deliberate. And it was followed immediately by the particular quality of silence that occurs when a building has absorbed a shock and is settling into its new condition. Then the footsteps. Overhead directly above them, moving in the coordinated pattern of a group that had trained to move this way, heavy and rhythmic and without hesitation. A voice filtered down through the floorboards, clipped, and commanding target is in the building. Move to the secondary point, Harry said now. She looked at the lion's head. She thought with a clarity that surprised her about the fact that she was 65 years old and standing in the basement of a house she had never entered before this evening, about to put her hand into a brass mechanism of unknown provenance because a man she had met 40 minutes ago was asking her to. She thought about the footprints in the foyer and the image of Patricia outside her school and the note her father had written on the back of a photograph and the date on the notary stamp. She put her hand in. The cold of the brass was immediate and complete. The mechanism locked around her wrist in the same motion, a concealed clamp that engaged without warning and held her hand immobile inside the cavity. She felt the sharp sting of the sampling needle in the pad of her index finger and drew a breath but did not pull back because pulling back against the mechanism like this would cause more damage than holding still. Above them, the door at the top of the stone stairs was kicked open with enough force that she heard the impact of it against the wall. The sound of boots on stone began measured and fast. Harry pressed himself against the wall beside the door and held the flashlight like a weapon. The machine worked. She could feel it working through the subtle vibrations in the mechanism against her wrist, a series of mechanical progressions that she could not see but could trace by sensation. The click of a relay, the hum of a motor, the sequential engagement of components in a sequence that Eleanor had specified and a contractor had built and no one had used until this moment. A voice at the top of the stairs said something she could not make out. The clamp released. She pulled her hand free. Her index finger was bleeding from a small, precise puncture, and she pressed it against her palm without thinking about it. The blast door shifted by a fraction of an inch, breaking the seal of the pressurized space beyond, and a rush of filtered cold air moved past her face. Harry hit the edge of the door with his shoulder and hauled it open with everything he had. He grabbed her arm and pulled her through into the space beyond, then threw himself against the door from the inside and drove the deadbolt home with both hands in the same motion. The first burst of gunfire struck the exterior of the door less than 2 seconds later, the sound of it muffled but unmistakable, a hammering against steel that went on for several seconds and then stopped. She stood in the filtered air of the vault and put her back against the cold concrete wall and breathed. The vault was not what she had expected. She had expected a room. What she found was a facility. Server racks ran along 2 walls, their indicator lights cycling in steady blue. Filing cabinets of heavy steel stood in organized rows. Climate control equipment occupied a section of the rear wall. And at the center of the space, positioned on a reinforced platform, sat a titanium safe of a size that suggested its contents were measured not by volume but by importance. Harry was already at the computer terminal, typing with the rapid precision of a man working from memory rather than reading what he typed. On the small security monitor mounted above the terminal, she could see the exterior of the blast door. The men outside had retrieved equipment from somewhere beyond camera range and were setting it up against the door surface, a compact welding apparatus with a lance tip that was already beginning to glow. He said, "Thermal lance. 14 minutes to cut through the door material. We have somewhat less time than that before they are inside." She said, "Then talk fast." He kept typing while he spoke, his eyes on the progress bar that had appeared on the terminal screen, a data transfer in progress. He told her about Eleanor Whitfield, Not the version Mercer had offered, which was a biographical sketch stripped of everything that mattered. The real version. In the late 1980s, Eleanor had been a senior forensic auditor for an independent oversight committee operating out of Washington. Her assignment was Caldwell Dynamics, a defense contractor with aerospace and weapon systems. Contracts worth billions annually, the kind of company whose name appeared regularly in financial publications next to words like Titan and industry leader. What Eleanor found inside their books was not the kind of discrepancy that accountants make by accident. It was a systemic architecture of fraud constructed deliberately over years, diverting substantial portions of Department of Defense contract funds into offshore accounts that in turn funded a program of chemical weapons testing conducted on civilian populations in regions where oversight was minimal and accountability was non-existent. Eleanor brought her findings to her superiors. 3 days later, the apartment building where she lived in Northern Virginia was firebombed. She was not inside when it burned because she had already understood what 3 days of silence from her superiors actually meant. She took everything. The primary source documents, the unredacted ledgers, the shipping manifests, the internal correspondence. She vanished. She purchased this property through a corporate shell, renovated it into what it had become, and spent the next 30 years building a case so comprehensive and so thoroughly documented that no amount of institutional pressure could suppress it, while Caldwell Dynamics spent those same 30 years looking for her. 2 weeks ago, they found her, a compromised delivery driver, a compound called thallium odorless and tasteless introduced into her weekly grocery order over a period of months. It took her down slowly, giving her time to initiate the vault lockdown before she lost the ability to do so. Meg said, and Mercer. Harry said David Carmichael was the name Eleanor used in Oregon. Douglas Mercer is the name he used in Portland. The man is the same. He notified Caldwell the moment the probate paperwork cleared. He sent you here knowing what was waiting. On the monitor, the thermal lance was fully operational, its tip pressed against a point on the door's surface that had begun to glow at its edges. She said, "Who is the fourth signal?" He stopped typing and looked at her. She moved to the monitor and pointed at the thermal feed from the camera covering the estate's main gate. 3 signals were inside the perimeter, moving toward the house. The fourth was stationary at the gate itself, positioned not with the others, but at the point of exit facing outward toward the logging road. He said, "That one is not part of the assault team." She said, "Then what are they doing?" He said, "Waiting, blocking the road." She said, "Waiting for what?" He said, "For someone to come out." She watched the fourth signal. It held its position with a patience that had a specific quality to it, the patience of someone who expected to be waiting for a while and had accepted that fact without discomfort. This was not a person standing guard against an intrusion from outside. This was a person stationed to ensure that nothing escaped from inside. He said quietly, "The person at that gate has access to my original security schematics for this property. They know which direction any extraction route from this building would lead. I designed one primary escape route when I built the tunnel network, and it exits near the northern boundary. That is where they are positioned." She said, "Someone gave them your plans." He said, "Someone had access to them. I have been inside this property for 22 years. The number of people who could have accessed those documents without my knowledge is very small." The progress bar on the terminal reached completion. He pulled a ruggedized external drive from the port and held it in one hand while he moved to the titanium safe. He worked the dial from memory, a 3-number combination he had clearly used enough times that his hands performed the sequence without conscious direction. The lever disengaged. The safe door swung open. Inside was no money. There were ledgers, dozens of them, bound in aged cloth and stacked with care. And on top of the stack, a single manila folder, its tab marked in Eleanor's handwriting with 3 words. Ashford, primary asset. He picked up the folder and held it for a moment without opening it. When he looked at her, his expression had changed from the controlled efficiency of the past 20 minutes into something that cost him more to show. He said, "I was not always what I am now. 25 years ago, I was employed by Caldwell Dynamics as a private security contractor. My specific function was asset recovery and threat containment. When Eleanor disappeared with their documents, I was part of the team assigned to find her. I was the one who traced the evidence trail to Oregon." She said nothing. She waited. He said, "I found her first, before anyone else on the team. And when I found her, I sat in this library in this chair, and she made tea and she showed me something. Not the ledgers, not the financial records. She showed me a different kind of document, a list of names with dates and locations and outcomes. People who had been used as subjects for testing programs that Caldwell's offshore accounts were paying for. Ordinary people in places where nobody was watching. The outcomes column was not complex. Most of the entries said the same thing." He set the folder on the terminal surface. He said, "I contacted Eleanor rather than my handlers. I offered her an exchange, my operational knowledge for her protection and my assistance in maintaining this facility. She accepted," she said in the Courier. He opened the folder. The documents inside were a record, systematic and detailed, of a series of transfers across more than a decade. Evidence fragments distributed through a network of contacts arriving at various journalists and investigators in pieces small enough that no single delivery represented the full picture, but large enough that each one mattered. The name that appeared consistently in the chain of custody documentation, the name that appeared as the human link between Eleanor's hidden fortress and the outside world, was one she recognized before she read it. Arthur Ashford. The sound that came from her was not quite a word. It was something that happened before words in the part of the body that processes recognition before language can catch up with it. He said, "Your father moved the evidence for 11 years. Different routes, different contacts, never repeating a pattern. Eleanor provided the materials. He ensured they reached people who could use them. He was extraordinarily careful. He understood what he was carrying and what it would mean if it was intercepted." She said he died on Interstate 5 in November of 1989. The accident report said he lost control on a wet surface. He said there was no accident, Margaret. He said Raymond Croft was Caldwell's chief fixer. He'd been assigned to monitor your father's movements for 3 months before the incident. On November 11th, 1989, Arthur was transporting a ledger that contained the documented record of payments made to a federal judge in exchange for rulings that protected Caldwell's government contracts. Croft's team knew what he was carrying. They made contact with his vehicle on the interstate at a point where the road ran beside a drainage channel. He paused. He said Arthur understood what was happening. He did not attempt to stop the car. He accelerated toward the embankment on the right side of the road, and the impact threw the cargo in the rear of the vehicle clear of the wreckage and into the drainage channel below the road grade. Croft's team spent 4 hours searching for the ledger. They never found it. The drainage channel carried it half a mile downstream. It was recovered by Eleanor's network 6 weeks later. 35 years. She had been 30 years old when a police officer came to the door of the apartment she shared with her husband and told them about the accident on Interstate 5. She had stood in that doorway and listened and held Patricia, who was 3 years old, and did not understand why her mother's face had changed, and she had carried the shape of that loss through everything that came afterward. Through the end of her marriage and the building of her career and the raising of her daughter and the collapse of her firm, and the shape of it had been an absence, a space where a man should have been and was not. What Harold Crane had just told her did not fill that space. Nothing would fill it. But it changed its nature entirely because the space was no longer the shape of a random act of fate. It was the shape of a decision, a deliberate, irreversible choice made by a man who understood what he was choosing and chose it anyway, not because he wanted to leave his daughter without a father, but because the alternative was to allow something worse to continue. She sat down on the cold concrete floor, not from weakness, from the need to be in contact with something solid and true, while her understanding of 35 years reorganized itself around a new center. She looked at her hands. The index finger had stopped bleeding. A small dark mark remained where the needle had entered. She said quietly, "He knew they were coming." He said yes. She said, and he drove into the embankment to keep the ledger out of their hands. He said, "That is what the evidence indicates." Eleanor believed it. She spent years afterward unable to forgive herself for involving him. She said, "Is that why she cut off contact with the family?" He said, "She was trying to protect you. She believed that any connection between her and your mother or you would give Caldwell a lever to use against her. She made the choice that she believed would keep you safer than the alternative. Whether it was the right choice is a question she asked herself every day until she could no longer form the question." A shower of orange sparks erupted at the edges of the blast door. The lance was cutting through the outer layer. The temperature in the vault had already climbed several degrees and would continue to climb faster now. He moved immediately, returning to the terminal and pulling up a secondary security feed. The fourth thermal signal at the gate had shifted. It was moving now not toward the house, but parallel to the northern boundary of the property, toward the point where the underground passage would emerge. He said, "They know which way you will run." She said, "You just said someone gave them your plans." He said, "Yes." She said, "Someone who had access to your schematics without your knowledge over 22 years. Someone who has been patient enough to wait for this specific moment." He did not answer. He was already at the titanium safe, pulling the ledgers and placing them carefully into a waterproof canvas satchel alongside the ruggedized drive. He placed a slim leather-bound notebook in after them, the kind used for handwritten records, and sealed the satchel. He said, "The drive contains the digitized records. The notebook is the physical decryption key. Without the notebook, the drive is encrypted to a standard that current computing cannot break. Together they are everything Eleanor built." He handed the satchel to her. She put it over her shoulder. It was heavier than it looked. He moved to a heavy rolling filing cabinet along the rear wall and pushed it aside, revealing a section of the concrete foundation that had been cut and finished into a passage entrance approximately 3 feet wide and 4 feet high. The air from inside it was cold and carried the smell of deep earth and rock, the smell of something that had been sealed for a long time. He said, "This was an original bootlegger tunnel. It runs through the bedrock for approximately half a mile and exits near the northern logging road. Walk straight and do not stop. There are no branches." She said, "And you." He moved to the desk and lifted a red plastic cover that had been sitting flat against the surface, revealing a physical toggle switch beneath it. He did not touch the switch. He looked at her. He said, "There is a secondary exit that I prepared 5 years ago, when I began to consider the possibility that this specific situation might eventually occur. I am not going to tell you where it is, because if you are caught between here and Seattle, the less you know, the better for both of us. What I am going to tell you is this: do not assume I am dead, and do not come back here to find out. She said, you are going to activate the building charges. He said the entire structure has been rigged since 1994. Eleanor always described it as the final argument. If the vault is breached, the evidence on those servers is corrupted by the dead man's switch she built into the system. But the physical copies in that satchel are real, and you are carrying them, and that is what matters. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small envelope sealed with wax, her name written on the front in the same handwriting the note from Eleanor she had read in Mercer's office. He placed it in the outer pocket of the satchel. He said, open this in Seattle, not in the truck, not at a gas station. Seattle. When you have arrived and you know what you are about to do, it will mean something to you that it cannot mean right now. She looked at him. She looked at the envelope. She looked at the force signal on the monitor, which had stopped moving and was now positioned precisely at the point where the tunnel would surface. And she thought about what Harold Crane had said about someone having access to his plans. She said the force signal at the tunnel exit. They knew to go there. That means the information about this facility came from someone who had access to detailed knowledge of its layout, not just the general location. He said, yes. She said, how many people in 22 years have had that access? He said, very few. I am aware of the question you are asking, and I do not have a complete answer. What I can tell you is that Raymond Croft Caldwell, Senior Operations Director, has been personally involved in this file since Eleanor disappeared. He would not send a team and stand at a distance. He would be here. She looked at the fourth signal, stationary at the tunnel exit, positioned as though certain of which direction to face. She said, that is him. He said, I believe so. And I believe he intended to be close enough to personally confirm the outcome of tonight's operation, which means he is not expecting anyone to walk out of this tunnel. The blast door groaned with a sound that communicated the structural limits of even reinforced metal encountering sustained thermal stress. The glowing circle at its center had reached a diameter of approximately 18 inches. He said, go. She moved toward the tunnel entrance. She stopped. She said, my father drove into an embankment to keep a ledger out of their hands. And it worked. They never got it. He said, no, they never did. She said, then I am going to make sure that was worth something. She crouched through the tunnel entrance. Behind her, she heard the sound of the filing cabinet being pushed back across the concrete, concealing the opening. Then the sound of Harold Crane returning to the terminal, his footsteps measured and unhurried in the way of a man who has made a decision he is at peace with. The tunnel was close and cold and dark except for the beam of her flashlight. The walls were cut rock irregular and close on both sides, and the floor was hard-packed earth that had compressed over decades into something approaching stone. She moved through it the way she had learned to move through difficult spaces, which was steadily and without fighting the discomfort, accepting the narrowness and the cold and the smell of deep earth as conditions to be worked with rather than against. She heard the blast door give way behind her. The sound of it was not loud through the distance, and the rock, but the concussion that followed was loud enough to feel. It came through the ground and through the walls and through the soles of her boots, simultaneously a wave of force that moved through the mountain like something alive. The shockwave hit her in the legs and she went down hard onto the tunnel floor. Hands out the satchel swinging into the wall beside her, dust fell from the ceiling. The flashlight skittered forward and she grabbed it before it rolled out of reach. Above her, very far above her, through tons of timber and stone and Oregon earth, something enormous was burning. She lay still for 3 seconds. She thought about the fourth signal at the tunnel exit. Raymond Croft positioned at precisely the point where the tunnel would surface, not expecting anyone to emerge. She stood up. She ran. She ran toward the northern road toward Seattle and toward a reckoning that had been 35 years in the making, carrying in a waterproof satchel every document that could prove what had been done and who had ordered it, and in her outer pocket a sealed envelope she was not yet allowed to open. The tunnel ended where the mountain decided to let go of it. One moment she was moving through cut rock, and then the floor angled upward sharply and the ceiling dropped, and she was pushing through compacted earth and root systems, with her hands pulling herself toward a gray luminescence that was not quite light, but was considerably less dark than what she had left behind. She came out through a collapse of soil and rotted timber and fell down the outside face of the embankment, sliding on wet grass and exposed clay until the ground leveled and deposited her in a drainage ditch, running alongside a track she recognized as the logging road that had brought her here from the north. She lay on her back in several inches of cold water and looked up at the November sky and breathed. Behind her, above the tree line and miles up the mountain pass, the sky was the color of a forge. Not firelight exactly, something larger than firelight, the kind of illumination that has mass and weight, a column of orange and red that was visible against the low cloud cover and would be visible for considerably longer than this night. Oak Haven was burning with the totality of something that had been designed to burn completely. She stood up, she checked the satchel. The seal was intact, the exterior wet, but the waterproof lining doing what it had been built to do. She pressed her hand against the outer pocket and felt the shape of the sealed envelope through the fabric. She began walking north along the logging road, keeping to the tree line where the canopy provided intermittent cover from the rain that had strengthened in the past hour. She moved steadily and without rushing, because rushing was for people who had options about their pace, and she had 3 miles of unpaved road between herself and anything that resembled civilization, and she was 65 years old, and her right knee had been informing her since the tunnel that it had opinions about what had happened tonight that would need to be addressed at length in the coming days. She thought about Raymond Croft positioned at the tunnel exit, expecting no one to emerge. She did not know what had happened at that position. She did not know whether the fourth signal had remained at its station when the explosion occurred or had moved toward the house. She knew only that she had emerged from a different point than the one that had been anticipated, which meant either Harold Crane had additional tunnel infrastructure beyond what he had described, or the fourth signal had been wrong about the exact exit coordinates, or both. She filed the question and kept walking. The gas station appeared at the 2-mile mark, a single-story structure with a canopy over 2 pump islands and a diner attached to the right side, its windows showing the amber interior light of a place that intended to stay open through the night regardless of who needed it. The parking area held 3 vehicles, one of which was a heavy freight truck with the name of a produce company on its trailer. She went directly to the women's restroom on the near side of the building, a single occupancy room with a door that locked from inside. She ran the tap and leaned over the sink and looked at what the mirror showed her. The mud on her face had dried to a pale clay color, except where the rain had cut channels through it. There was blood on her collar from her finger dried to brown. Her jacket was torn at the left shoulder where she had gone down in the tunnel, and the knee of her right trouser leg was dark with the same clay mud as her face. She washed her face with cold water and used paper towels to address the worst of the visible damage. She unwrapped the strip of jacket lining she had torn in the tunnel and rebound her index finger more cleanly with a folded paper towel held in place by the lace she had pulled from her left boot. She was examining the result in the mirror when the mirror showed her something she had not expected to see. The window on the far wall of the restroom was small and positioned high, designed for ventilation rather than visibility. Through it, rendered in the amber parking lot light and the intermittent glow from the canopy, was the profile of a county sheriff's department vehicle. Not parked at the fuel pumps, parked at the far edge of the lot facing the building, engine running, positioned to observe both the restroom door and the main diner entrance simultaneously. Dale Briggs had not driven away from Willow Creek to attend to other business. He had driven 30 miles north along the logging road network to the only commercial establishment between the mountain and the interstate, and he had arrived here before her, which meant he had known which direction she would travel and had moved to intercept the route rather than pursue directly. She turned off the tap. She dried her hands. She considered the geometry of the situation with the same methodical attention she would have applied to a structural problem. One exit from the restroom, one vehicle in the lot with an unobstructed view of that exit. A man who had spent 12 years ensuring that problems connected to Oak Haven did not develop into complications. The door opened before she reached it. Dale Briggs was larger in the enclosed space of the restroom than he had seemed at the gas station in Willow Creek. He stepped inside and let the door close behind him and stood with his back against it in a way that was not aggressive but made the architecture of the situation entirely clear. He was not in uniform. He had a county badge on his jacket but no duty belt, no visible firearm, and his hands were at his sides and open. He said without preamble, "I need the bag." She said, "You drove ahead of me. You knew which way I would come out." He said, "There are two ways off that mountain. I covered the one that made sense." She said, "You have been doing this for 12 years, covering the approaches, making sure nobody asked questions about a property that nobody was supposed to know had anything worth asking questions about." He said, "I did my job." She said, "They paid you to do a job. That is different from doing your job." Something moved across his face at that, a displacement too subtle to name precisely, but visible enough that she registered it. She had spent 40 years in rooms with people who were invested in appearing to be something other than what they were, and she had learned to read the small involuntary signals that announced the distance between the performance and the reality. He said, "The bag, I'm not going to ask again." She said, "How much did they pay you?" He said, "Enough." She said, "Enough to be here at 2 in the morning without your uniform, asking a 65-year-old woman for a canvas bag in a gas station bathroom. That is what enough bought you. I want you to look at that clearly." He said, "Don't do that." She said, "You told me you are not a bad person. You said that to me specifically." People who are at peace with their choices do not feel the need to characterize themselves to the people they are trying to intimidate. The room was 4 feet wide and 7 feet long. She was standing at the sink. He was at the door. There was a metal wastebasket on the floor between them, the kind bolted to a bracket on the wall but positioned such that its swing arc extended into the center of the space when opened. The door behind him opened inward on a right side hinge. The gap between the left side of his body and the left wall was approximately 16 inches. She kicked the wastebasket bracket with the heel of her boot hard enough that the bin swung out on his bracket and into the space between them. In the fraction of a second that his eyes tracked the movement, she stepped left, not toward the door, but toward the wall, which forced him to rotate his body to follow her, rather than simply extending his arm. The rotation created the clearance she needed on the right side. She moved through it, hit the door handle with her palm, and was outside before the restroom door finished its swing. She walked directly across the parking lot to the diner entrance without looking back. She was aware that he would follow, and she moved at a pace designed to communicate that she was unconcerned about that fact. Because the moment she ran, she became a problem to be contained rather than a woman walking across a parking lot. Inside the diner, 4 people. A cook visible through the service window. A young woman behind the counter who looked up when the door opened. An older couple in a rear booth who did not look up. And the freight truck driver, a man in his mid-50s with the particular stillness of someone in the middle of a long haul, and in no hurry about anything that was not his cargo. She placed $300 in cash on the counter in front of the young woman. She said, "I need to get to Seattle. I need to ride with someone going north." The driver looked at the money on the counter, then at her, then at the door she had come through. He said, "I pull out in 15 minutes, going to Tacoma first, then up to Seattle." She said, "That works." She sat on the stool at the far end of the counter with the satchel in her lap and her back to the wall and watched the door. Dale Briggs came through it 40 seconds later. He stood in the entrance and looked at the room. His eyes found her. Then they moved to the driver, then to the money no longer on the counter, then back to her. He stood there for a long time, long enough that the cook's radio filled the silence with something that might have been country music or might have been something else entirely. Long enough that the young woman behind the counter found reasons to look at the surface she was wiping rather than at the man in the doorway. Then Dale Briggs put his hands in his jacket pockets and walked back out into the parking lot. She heard his engine start. She watched through the window as his headlights moved across the far end of the lot, turned toward the southern road, and disappeared. 12 years. But not this. Whatever he had told himself, those 12 years required of him this specific thing in this specific room was not something he was willing to be. She sat with that for a moment, not with gratitude, because gratitude would have been the wrong thing to feel about a man who had spent a decade and a half ensuring that the truth about what had happened to her father stayed buried, but with something adjacent to it, a recognition that the line people draw for themselves, however late and however insufficient, is still a line. The truck driver's name was Frank. He did not ask questions, which she appreciated and which she rewarded with a silence that he appeared to find equally comfortable. She climbed into the sleeper cab, and he pulled out of the lot precisely when he had said he would, and the truck settled into the rhythms of the interstate with the particular constancy of a machine designed to cover distance without drama. She waited until they had been on the road for 20 minutes before she opened the satchel. The leather notebook was at the top. She had not looked at it closely in the vault. It was slim and old, the leather cover worn smooth at the corners, the pages inside filled with columns of handwritten alphanumerics in Eleanor's precise penmanship. The cipher system was apparent even without the key to decode it, the structure of it visible in the recurring patterns of the groupings. She turned to the final pages. There, folded inside the back cover and held in place by the tension of the binding, was a sheet of heavier paper than the notebook pages, cream-colored and filled with Eleanor's handwriting in a larger and more deliberate hand than the cipher columns. She turned on the small reading light mounted above the sleeper berth and read. Eleanor began with an apology that was not an apology for the danger but for the distance. She wrote that in the years after Arthur's death, she had considered reaching out to Meg on more than a dozen separate occasions, had gone so far on 3 of them as to draft a letter and address an envelope. Each time the calculation had resolved the same way. Any contact, any thread connecting Eleanor's existence to Meg's life was a thread that Raymond Croft and the people who employed him could follow. The decision to maintain silence was the most painful choice Eleanor had made in 30 years of painful choices, and she had made it because the alternative was to put her great niece in the position that Arthur had occupied, and she could not bear to do that to Arthur's daughter. Then Eleanor wrote something Meg had not expected. She wrote that the collapse of Meg's architectural firm was not the consequence of Leonard Gable's individual character, though his character had certainly been equal to the task. Gable had been approached by a Caldwell intermediary approximately 18 months before the bankruptcy filing. The terms of the arrangement had been straightforward. Gable would use his position within the firm to execute a series of financial maneuvers, that would leave the company insolvent and leave Meg personally liable for the resulting debt. In exchange, he would receive a sum sufficient to establish himself elsewhere and the assurance that no criminal referral would follow him. Caldwell had orchestrated her financial ruin deliberately with the specific purpose of ensuring that when the probate notification arrived, Meg would be desperate enough to act on it without extensive deliberation. They wanted her in the vault, they needed her bloodline to open it, and they needed her to arrive at Oak Haven in a state of mind that would prioritize immediate action over careful questioning. She set the letter down for a moment. She looked at the dark highway through the gap in the curtain that separated the sleeper from the cab. 40 years of work, the firm, the debt, the storage unit, and the forwarding address at the print shop, and the $90 a month, and the instant meals eaten standing in a borrowed kitchen. All of it manufactured, all of it engineered to produce a specific outcome. She picked the letter up and kept reading. Eleanor wrote, "In the lining of the satchel you are carrying, stitched into the bottom panel, beneath the waterproof layer, you will find a card with a routing number and an account identifier. The account is held at a private institution in Geneva under a corporate registration that Caldwell has never been able to trace because I established it through 3 intermediary structures before they knew they needed to look for it. The balance is approximately $12 million. This is money that Caldwell used to fund the overseas testing programs. I removed it from their accounts incrementally over 27 years, a few $1,000s at a time from different accounts, never enough in any single transaction to trigger a review. It belongs to no one now. I am leaving it to you. Use it however you choose. I would suggest that some portion of it go toward making certain that what happened to the people in those testing programs is never allowed to become abstract or statistical. They deserve better than to be a line item in a legal proceeding." Then in smaller writing at the bottom of the page, added after the main letter had been completed, Eleanor had written a name: Sandra Howell, FBI Financial Crimes Division, a phone number with a Washington area code, and below the number, a single sentence: "She has been following the same offshore account chain for 7 years and lacks only the documentation to act. I contacted her indirectly 3 months ago. She is waiting and she will know what to do with what you are carrying. And when you meet her, ask her what name she has been using internally for this case file. Her answer will tell you something important." Meg read the last line again. Ask her what name she has been using internally for this case file. Eleanor had known something about how Sandra Howell had categorized this investigation, and she had known it was information that would be meaningful to Meg specifically, which meant it involved a name Meg would recognize. She folded the letter back into the notebook and held it in her lap for the remaining hours of the drive. She did not sleep. Outside, the interstate carried them north through the dark, and somewhere behind her, a mountain was still burning. They reached Seattle as the marine layer was beginning to thin at the edges. Frank pulled the truck into a depot lot in the Soto district, and she climbed down from the cab, thanked him without elaborating, and oriented herself by the skyline. The Seattle Chronicle building was 12 blocks north. She walked it. The lobby security desk was staffed by a single guard who was managing the particular alertness of someone at the tail end of an overnight shift. She followed a group of early arriving staff through the badge reader turnstile without pausing, which worked because it always worked, because people who appear to belong somewhere are almost never questioned about whether they do. The 5th floor was sparsely populated at this hour. She found Calvin Reed's desk by the archaeology of it, the accumulated strata of a person who had been working in the same space for a long time, files and systems that made sense only to the person who had developed them, coffee cups in a pattern that traced the geography of his work habits. Reed himself was at his monitor, typing with the focused velocity of someone running against a deadline, a rumpled corduroy jacket over a shirt that suggested he had been here since the previous afternoon. He did not look up when she stopped at the edge of his desk. He said, "If you are from legal, I have already told them I have two independent sources on the zoning file, and I am publishing Thursday." She said, "I am not from legal. I am Arthur Ashford's daughter." The typing stopped, not slowed, stopped, completely and immediately the way a machine stops when power is cut. He looked up. She watched his eyes move across her face, her jacket, the satchel, her bandaged finger, and settle back on her face with an expression she recognized as the look of a person who has been waiting for something for a very long time and has recently stopped believing it would arrive. 25 years earlier, Calvin Reed had been a junior reporter at a regional paper covering the Interstate 5 incident in which Arthur Ashford had died. He had been the first journalist to note the anomalous skid mark data, the first to request the accident reconstruction report under public records law, and the first to receive a legal threat from a Washington firm he had never heard of within 36 hours of filing that request. His editor had pulled the story. Reed had kept the notes. He stood up and guided her to a soundproof glass conference room at the end of the floor without asking her to explain herself in the open office. He closed the door and sat across from her. She placed the ruggedized drive and the leather notebook on the table between them. She said, "This is the complete financial and operational record of Caldwell Dynamics from 1987 to the present. It documents a systematic program of Department of Defense contract fraud, the offshore funding of illegal chemical weapons testing on civilian populations, the corruption of a federal judge, and the murder of my father. The notebook is the decryption key. Without it, the drive is unreadable." He looked at the drive. He looked at the notebook. He looked at her. He said, "If this is what you say it is, they will move against both of us before we can get it to print." She said, "I know, which is why we are not printing it." He said, "Then what are we doing?" She said, "We are uploading the decrypted files simultaneously to a distribution list that includes every major news syndicate with the Washington Bureau, the Department of Justice, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. 40 separate recipients receiving the same package at the same moment. You cannot suppress 40 simultaneous releases with legal action. By the time a court could act, it would already be public in enough jurisdictions to be irreversible." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I need 45 minutes to build the distribution infrastructure securely. If I rush it, the encryption on the transmission fails." She said, "Then start now." He plugged in. The drive opened the notebook and began. He had been working for 20 minutes when Frank Kowalski walked in without knocking. Kowalski was the Chronicle's managing editor, a man in his early 60s with the institutional wariness of someone who had navigated the paper through 3 rounds of corporate ownership changes and 2 significant libel actions. He wore reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the expression of a man who had received a phone call he did not enjoy receiving. He said, "Reed, I need a word." Reed did not look up from his screen. He said, "I am in the middle of something, Frank." Kowalski looked at Meg. He said, "At 5:30 this morning, I received a call from a law firm in Washington, D.C., representing a defense contractor named Caldwell Dynamics. They informed me that a woman matching a specific description might attempt to bring fabricated financial documents to this building, and that accepting or publishing those documents would expose the Chronicle to substantial legal liability. They asked me to contact them immediately if such a person appeared." He stopped. He looked at Meg with the expression of a man waiting for her to either confirm or deny something. She said, "You received that call at 5:30 this morning?" He said, "Yes." She said I did not arrive in Seattle until 40 minutes ago. I have not contacted anyone from the city in the past 12 hours, which means Caldwell's attorneys knew I was coming here before I arrived, which means they have been tracking my movements, which means the phone call you received was not a precaution. It was an attempt to neutralize this building before I reached it. You are not being warned, Mr. Kowalski. You are being managed. He looked at her steadily. She said, in approximately 20 minutes, Calvin is going to send a package of documents to 40 simultaneous recipients. If those documents are what I believe them to be, this paper will be the first outlet in the country to have published them, and the legal liability you are currently worried about will be indistinguishable from a rounding error compared to what Caldwell Dynamics is about to face. If you want to stop him, you can try. But you should understand what you are choosing. A silence extended into the room. Reed continued typing through it. Kowalski removed his glasses from his forehead, polished them with the end of his jacket, replaced them and said, I am going to need to be in the room when the distribution goes out. Then the conference room door opened again, and the woman who stepped through it was someone Meg had not met but had been expecting. Sandra Howell was 42 years old with the specific economy of movement that comes from years of operating in environments where excess motion is a liability. Her blazer was dark and her badge was on the table before she finished introducing herself, placed there as a courtesy rather than an assertion. She said she was with the Financial Crimes Division of the FBI and that she had received a call at 4 that morning from an unidentified male caller who had read her a sequence of account routing numbers she had been tracking for 7 years. She said the caller did not identify himself, but he knew the case file number I was using internally, which is not public information, and he knew the account sequence down to the last 4 digits of the secondary identifier. She looked at Meg. She said, he also said that Arthur Ashford's daughter would be bringing documentation to this building this morning and that she would be able to verify what he had told me. Meg said, what is the name of your case file? Howell paused. Just briefly. She said, internally we have been calling it the Harrington file because the first physical evidence fragment we ever received 11 years ago was delivered by a man named Arthur Ashford to a contact in Portland. It arrived with no cover letter, no explanation, just a photocopied page from a financial ledger and a first name. Arthur. We never knew his surname. A colleague called it the Harrington file because of the name on the envelope it arrived in, forwarded from a post box in Oregon. The envelope was addressed to a Margaret Harrington. We assumed it was a misdirect, that someone had used a false name. The file kept that name internally because we never found a reason to change it. Meg sat with that for a moment. Arthur had sent the first fragment to a contact in Portland and addressed the envelope in a name that was not quite her name, but close enough to be unambiguous to anyone who knew what to look for. Her mother's family name before she married. He had sent the envelope to a contact he knew would eventually reach the right hands, and he had put a version of his daughter's name on the outside of it, not as a clue, as a dedication. She said he was telling you who it was for, not who sent it. Howell said, that is what I believe now. Yes, Kowalski had not left the room. He was standing near the door with his arms crossed and his reading glasses on, and the expression of a man who has just finished revising his understanding of what kind of morning this was going to be. Reed said without looking up, I need a decision in the next 12 minutes. We have a court injunction inbound. Caldwell's attorneys filed at 7:15 for a temporary restraining order against publication. It has a 90-minute window before it hits a judge's desk. Howell said I can issue a federal hold on Raymond Croft at Dulles International Airport. He is booked on a 7 o'clock departure to Abu Dhabi, non-extradition territory. If I make the call now, he does not board that flight. Meg said, make the call. Howell stepped to the far corner of the room and put her phone to her ear. Reed typed. Kowalski stood with his arms crossed and did not interfere. The injunction clock ran in the background of everything. At the 38-minute mark, Howell returned from the corner and said Croft is being detained at the gate. 2 agents from the field office. At the 43-minute mark, Reed looked up from his screen for the first time since the session had begun. He said, ready. Meg looked at the drive sitting in the port. 40 years ago, almost exactly, Eleanor Whitfield had been sitting in an office in Washington with a stack of documents and the understanding that bringing them to her superiors would end her career and very nearly ended her life. She had chosen a different direction. She had taken the documents and run, and she had spent 30 years turning that single act of preservation into something too large and too thorough to suppress. And then she had called in the one debt that the universe still owed her, which was Meg. Meg said, send it. Reed pressed the key. The progress indicators populated across the screen one after another, 40 separate confirmations arriving in a sequence that took less than 5 seconds. Then it was done and the room was quiet, and somewhere in 40 different servers in 40 different locations, the same package of documents was sitting in the queue waiting to be opened. Kowalski said quietly, well, the first market reaction appeared on Reed's secondary monitor at 11:47, a Bloomberg alert flagging unusual selling pressure on Caldwell Dynamics stock. By 12:15, the AP wire was running a story. By 12:30, every major broadcast network had broken from regular programming with the same footage, the front entrance of Caldwell's Virginia headquarters, and 3 black FBI vehicles in the parking lot. By 2 in the afternoon, the stock had dropped from $127 to $51. Kowalski had moved to a chair and was reading the incoming copy from the wire with the expression of a man who was recalibrating his professional life in real time. Reed was on the phone with 3 separate editors, simultaneously, his voice carrying the specific energy of someone who has been waiting 25 years to make exactly these phone calls. Howell stopped beside Meg on her way out of the conference room. She said Raymond Croft was placed under federal arrest at Dulles at 1440. He did not resist. She paused. She said the caller at 4 this morning. Was he safe, Meg said. I do not know yet. She was alone in the conference room. The city outside the glass walls of the building was going about its Tuesday in the way cities go about their days when something enormous is happening somewhere inside them that most of their inhabitants have not yet heard about. By tonight, they would all have heard about it. By tomorrow, it would be the only story anyone was talking about. She opened the outer pocket of the satchel and took out the sealed envelope. She turned it over in her hands. Her name on the front in handwriting she was beginning to recognize. She opened it. Inside was a slip of paper with a phone number and 3 words. When you are safe. She looked at the phone number for a long time. She thought about the 4th thermal signal at the tunnel exit. She thought about what Harold Crane had said about a secondary exit that he had prepared 5 years earlier. She thought about the fact that a man who had lived inside a building for 22 years and had been maintaining its security systems for all of that time would have known every inch of its infrastructure, including the infrastructure that would have had to be in place before he could run the destruction sequence and then reach safety himself. She dialed the number. It rang twice. Harold Crane said, "Hello, Margaret." His voice was tired and had the quality of someone speaking through physical pain, but it was unmistakably and definitively the voice of a living person in a room somewhere, breathing air that was not underground and not on fire. She said, "You told me not to assume you were dead." He said, "And you did not." I noticed. She said, "The secondary exit. The drainage infrastructure. Eleanor had it built into the original renovation, didn't she? Not as a backup for you, she built it for herself, and you inherited it when you took over the facility. He said Eleanor was a thorough woman. She planned for contingencies that other people did not know to plan for. The duct system along the eastern foundation runs wide for a reason. I was inside it before the charges went. The blast was considerably more persuasive than I had anticipated in terms of physical force, but the distance held. She said Raymond Croft is in federal custody at Dulles. A silence, then he said, "Good. That is good." She said, "Were you the one at the tunnel exit, the fourth signal?" He said, "No. I do not know who that was. I was in the duct when that position was taken." If it was Croft himself, he is exactly the kind of man who would want to be present for the end of something he had been chasing for 30 years. She said he did not get the end he came for. He said no, he did not. She said, "What will you do now?" He said, "There will be proceedings, testimony. I have enough to offer the investigators that my cooperation will be of significant value, which is the best currency I have at this point. I will use it." She said Eleanor chose you for a reason. He said Eleanor chose me because I was the first person who ever pointed a weapon at her and then put it down. She said that told her more about a person's character than anything else she could think of. I have always suspected that was a considerable overestimation of what it tells you. She said, "I think she knew what she was doing." He said after a moment, "So do I. I just find it easier not to say so." Patricia arrived in Seattle at 4 in the afternoon, 3 hours after driving up from Eugene with a cardboard box in the back seat of her car. She looked at her mother's face when Meg opened the door of the coffee shop they had agreed to meet in, and she did not say anything about what she saw there, which was exactly the right response. They sat in a corner booth. The television above the espresso machine was showing continuous news coverage of the Caldwell proceedings, the footage cycling through the Virginia headquarters, the airport detention, the stock market graphic with its plunging line, the list of executives named in the federal warrants, which had reached 12 by late afternoon. Patricia set the cardboard box on the bench seat beside her. It was an ordinary document storage box, the kind sold at office supply stores, closed with a strip of packing tape that had dried and yellowed with age. She said it was in the storage unit, in the back of the second unit I rented after the divorce with the things from the apartment where I grew up. I have moved it 4 times without opening it because it was not labeled, and I told myself I would get to it eventually. Meg looked at the box. She said, "When did you know it was his?" Patricia said, "When you told me about Eleanor Whitfield on the phone yesterday, I had seen that name once a long time ago on an envelope in that box. I was 12 and I was looking for a school project I thought might be in storage, and I saw the name on a sealed envelope, and I put the lid back on the box, and I did not look again. I do not know why. I was 12. Maybe I understood something that I did not have language for yet." Meg said, "Where is the envelope?" Patricia reached into the box and brought it out. It was a standard business envelope, white, addressed in Arthur's handwriting to Meg's mother, at an address Meg recognized as the house where she had grown up. The return address was a post office box number with no name. The envelope had never been opened. The stamp in the upper right corner was dated November 1989. It had been written before he died, mailed before he died, received after. Meg's mother had kept it unopened for the 10 years she survived Arthur, and then Patricia had kept it unopened for 25 years after that, and now it was sitting on a table in a coffee shop in Seattle, while the man whose death it had outlived was being discussed on the television above the espresso machine. She opened it. The letter inside was a single page handwritten in Arthur's forward-leaning script, and it was short in the way that things are short when a person knows they are writing under time pressure and has decided to say only what matters most. He had written to Meg's mother. He had written that he might not be coming home from the trip he was making, and that if she was reading this, that was what had happened. He had not explained why. He had written that the explanation would come eventually from a direction she would not expect, and that when it did, she should not be afraid of it. He had written that what he was doing was the right thing, and that he was certain of that, and that certainty was not the same as being unafraid, but it was considerably better than its absence. And then he had written, "Tell Margaret that the world is full of things that need someone willing to stand between them and the people they would harm. She will understand this when she is old enough. She has always understood it, even when she did not know that she did." Patricia had her hand over her mouth. Meg looked at her father's handwriting on the page for a long time without speaking. He had known. He had known before he drove onto that road that he might not drive off it, and he had written a letter and sent it to his wife, and his wife had kept it sealed, because opening it would have made something true that she was not ready for it to be. And then his granddaughter had kept it sealed for reasons she was 12 years old and had not yet developed the vocabulary to explain. And now here it was 35 years later. The last thing Arthur Ashford had ever committed to paper, sitting in the afternoon light of a Seattle coffee shop, while the men who had ordered his death were being handcuffed in airports and corporate lobbies on every television in the country. She said quietly, "He knew." Patricia said he always did. Meg folded the letter carefully along its original creases and put it back in the envelope. She put the envelope in the inner pocket of her jacket where it settled against her ribs. They sat together for a while without talking. The news coverage continued overhead. A correspondent outside the Virginia headquarters was describing the scope of the federal action in the careful language of someone trying not to overstate something that was already too large to understate. A former Defense Department official was providing analysis. A financial reporter was displaying a chart. Meg pulled the burner phone from her jacket pocket. She found the international number for Leonard Gable's Amsterdam residence, which she had looked up 3 weeks earlier in a moment of anger she had decided at the time was unproductive. She dialed it. He answered on the third ring. She could hear in his voice before he said a word that he had been watching the same news coverage she had, that he had been watching it for hours, and that he had understood long before the phone rang what the name Caldwell Dynamics appearing in every headline meant for him specifically. He said her name. He said it in the way people say the names of people they have wronged when they realize the wronging has caught up with them, with a kind of frantic preemptive apology built into the syllables. She did not respond. She listened for 3 seconds while he tried to assemble words into an explanation that would accomplish something, and then she ended the call and dropped the phone in the trash can beside the table. She had nothing to say to Leonard Gable that the next several weeks would not say more effectively and with considerably greater permanence. Patricia watched her do this without comment. Then she said, "What do you do now?" Meg said, "The same thing I have always done. I look at what is there, and I figure out what it needs to be." Patricia said, $12 million. Meg said, among other things. Patricia said, Eleanor said, Caldwell was only the first layer. Meg looked at her daughter. She said, "You read the letter." Patricia said, "You left the notebook on the table when you went to the counter." "I am your daughter." I read fast. Meg almost smiled. She said, "Yes, Caldwell is only the first layer." Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You are 65 years old, and you just escaped from an exploding building through a Prohibition-era tunnel in the middle of the night after opening a biometric vault with your own blood and carrying evidence of 30 years of federal crimes through 3 miles of mountain road. in a rainstorm, and now you are talking about what comes next." Meg said yes. Patricia looked at her for a long moment. The television overhead showed the face of Raymond Croft being escorted through an airport corridor by two federal agents. His expression, the particular blankness of someone who has decided that whatever he shows in public at this moment will be used against him later, and who has therefore chosen to show nothing. Patricia said, "I want you to know that I am terrified." Meg said, "I know." Patricia said, "I also want you to know that I am not going to tell you not to do it." Meg said, "I know that too." She picked up the satchel from the floor beside the booth. She checked the outer pocket where the sealed envelope had been, which was empty now, and the inner section where the drive and the notebook were secured, and the stitched lining at the base where Eleanor's card rested with its Geneva routing number and account identifier. She settled the strap on her shoulder. She stood. She said, "I am going to find a hotel with a shower and sleep for approximately 12 hours. Then I am going to a bank. Then I am going to find a lawyer who is not Douglas Mercer, and then we will see." She kissed her daughter on the top of her head, which was something she had not done since Patricia was very young, and which she did now not because it was sentimental, but because it was accurate, a physical expression of something true. She walked out of the coffee shop into the Seattle afternoon. The rain was light, the kind that does not require an umbrella but makes itself known in the steady accumulation of small drops on a coat and the particular smell of wet pavement that belongs to the Pacific Northwest in November. The city was going about its business. A delivery truck was double parked on the far side of the street. A man in a business suit was talking into his phone with the focused intensity of someone managing a crisis that had nothing to do with anything happening on any television screen in the country. Two college students were walking in the opposite direction, sharing earbuds, moving in the particular unhurried way of people whose most pressing concern is where to have lunch. Meg walked. She walked with the stride of someone who knows where she is going and is not in a hurry to get there, which is a different thing entirely from someone who is not in a hurry because they have nowhere to be. The difference is in the quality of the movement. One is drifting, the other is deliberate. She had come into the Oregon mountains with $80,000 in debt, a crowbar, and the intention of photographing a house so she could list it with a real estate agent. She was leaving with $12 million and a routing number and the knowledge of what her father had chosen on a wet November road 35 years ago, when the choice had presented itself to him with complete clarity. He had not hesitated. That was the thing she kept returning to. Not the bravery of it, though it was brave, but the certainty, the absolute steadiness of a decision made by someone who knew exactly what he valued and acted accordingly, without drama and without doubt. The ledger had survived, the evidence had survived, and now, finally, so had the truth. She reached the corner of Fifth and Pike and stopped for the light. Beside her, a man her age was watching the news on his phone, his face reflecting the blue light of whatever breaking development had just appeared on the screen. He shook his head slowly, the way people do when something large is happening, and they are still in the process of understanding its dimensions. The light changed. Margaret Ashford walked forward into the city, carrying everything that mattered, and leaving behind everything that no longer did, moving in the direction of what came next, with the particular steadiness of someone who has learned at considerable cost and over a very long time that the things we are most afraid of confronting are almost always the exact things we most needed to face. The silence that had haunted her family for 35 years was over. She was the one holding the keys now.